What is some dark shit going on around the world right now that the public probably doesn't know about? Saudi Arabia sentencing to death people who refuse to move out of their homes so that they can build Neom, their new mega city. And their relatives being sentenced to multiple decades of prison time just for protesting or merely posting their support to the cause on social media. In Africa, there is a very real and very extensive slave trade going on right now, to say nothing of the other probably 40 million living in bondage. It made me take more than a couple of moments to myself when I heard that there are likely more people in slavery today than there ever have been in history. Turn back, weary traveler. You have enough going on right now. Nothing in this thread is within your span of control and will only make you sad. Unless you have the money, power, or a workable idea to resolve global issues, there is nothing for you here. 70% of the world's chocolate comes from West Africa. An estimated 1.5 million child slaves are engaged in chocolate production in Ghana and the Ivory Coast alone, not counting Nigeria and Cameroon. I think we need a subreddit or news website dedicated to that kind of non-trending and barely known but actually very important news. Is there something like that out there? Anime_titties has a decent spread. Me. Hey, good one. Had a nice chuckle. Opens link. What a fuck, you weren't kidding. Bacterial resistance to antibiotics is at an alarming level. There has already been instances of pan-antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. This can throw us back to the pre-antibiotic era, which will effectively mean, catch an infection and die. No big pharma wants to invest in antibiotic research because of the huge R&D cost and relatively meager return. Although everyone agrees that we desperately need new antibiotics. Well, as soon as dying from infections becomes a rich people problem again, the interest will skyrocket. Every day a different person asks a slightly reworded question about what men or women want on AskReddit. That the vast majority of slavery still existing in the world right now is for agricultural purposes. And by slavery, I mean people owned by other people and forced to do work for no pay, as opposed to people doing what they need to do out of necessity and accepting what pittance they receive in return. And the produce is sold on the regular market, meaning that there is a non-zero chance that you have brought vegetables that were grown by literal slaves. Vegetables? Sure, but the most obvious answer is in the Middle East. Countries like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc. All of that infrastructure was built by foreign labor whose passports are confiscated. They're essentially stuck in those countries with harsh conditions and are treated as slaves, unable to go home. Who the hell do you think built the stadiums for the Qatar World Cup starting next month? Fast fashion is a human rights and an environmental disaster. There are certain parts of the garment construction process that cannot be mechanized, so humans have to be involved in the production, and the vast majority of them are underpaid. Additionally, fast fashion, especially in women's clothing, isn't made to last, so the fabric in the actual construction is shoddy and the clothes wear out quickly, but fabric recycling is rarely available, so most of those clothes end up in a landfill. Natural fibers release greenhouse gases, ETA. This is an issue in landfills because organic materials decompose in an anaerobic environment in landfills versus an aerobic composting environment, which creates more methane, source, as they decompose, and synthetics release chemicals into the water table. Thanks for sharing all this, guys. I don't think I'm living past 50 now. Behind every polished business facade is a hodgepodge of systems that are hacked together to service you. Data protection is second to revenue. All the networks and system engineers have the power to truly steal all your data. I'm in Mexico right now. Indigenous children are being sold for rape in the state of Guerrero like pieces of meat. Government turns a blind eye and civilians are threatened by the cartel. It's messed up. Mass kidnapping of school children in Nigeria and other African nations, and the only ones talking about it since 2021 is UNICEF. Propaganda is being used by several countries. Most of the Western countries, people forgets that propaganda can be used in a complex context through mass media. Always think critically and forge your opinions on a subject based on multiple sources and medias around the world. I don't think any of us average citizens have even the slightest idea what is really all going on in Ukraine, but only what we are being fed. Women going missing from Indian reservations across some of the US. Many are young women and probably being used for sex trafficking. There are some interesting podcasts on the subject. Human trafficking, you can literally be victim of this while visiting other places or on your vacations. Right now there are thousands of people that are being trafficked as mere objects. How about state-level law enforcement stealing identifiable property out of evidence control to pay snitches with it? Source: I lost my career over exposing this practice and everyone involved was promoted. The drift toward authoritarian rule and the dissolution of democracy. Somalia is pretty much gone at this point, facing war and one of its worst famines in ages. It would be a miracle if they make it through. Not sure what you mean by make it through. People will survive. The country hasn't had any kind of structure for years, so it'll continue doing that. At this point, Somalia is just what we call the land that borders Ethiopia. Female infanticide, i.e., the deliberate killing of newborn female children, is still happening in rural India. A full-term newborn baby is buried alive if unfortunate enough to be female. The mother is usually trying to get pregnant right after, until she finally gives birth to the prized male child. Sex trafficking in Ukraine. How better to disappear young women and children than during wartime? 9% of Eritrea's population is slaves. The prevalence of modern-day slavery is way more than people like to talk about. That 90+% of the local news you're seeing is basically just the same newscast from Texas to Florida, from Alaska to Washington. They just add in a traffic wreck or 7-Eleven shooting. The people that sit in those chairs are puppets. In America, there are corporations such as BlackRock buying up tons of houses, whole neighborhoods really. They're paying higher than asking price. They will then be permanently renting them out, and it will further destroy the middle class, working class. They will make middle class PPL permanent renters. And our politicians on both sides of the aisle are letting this happen because they take money from these corporations. The deforestation of Europe. The last protected ancient forests in Europe, mostly in the east, are cut down by big furniture companies from Finland and Austria. The people trying to protect the forests, activists, journalists, park rangers, are being intimidated, beaten and killed, while the police is looking the other way, or sometimes even participating in the abuse. Basically the same thing like in the Amazon basin, but with a lot less visibility. Humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970. There's anywhere between 25 to 50 active serial killers at least at any given point in time in the US alone. Sleep well. I actually thought the number was way higher, and this calmed me. France just deployed the Foreign Legion to secure gas fields and process plants in Yemen, in order to reduce their dependence on Russian LNG. Saudi Arabia is involved in a brutally aggressive war against Yemen. It has been called the biggest humanitarian crisis of the decade by some. Western governments are currently supplying Saudi with weapons that are immediately turned on Yemeni civilians. Millions of people are famished. France has just deployed. They're essentially on the side of Saudi Arabia, literally stealing Yemeni resources despite public outcry in France. The concentration camps that the Uyghur Muslims are in right now in China. It's devastatingly brutal. Check out these companies on the list for consideration of boycotting to try to make a difference, as if we needed one more reason not to buy Victoria's Secret. People are dying. BC, they can't afford their overpriced medication. A very easy save, just price gouging and horrible healthcare. 8,000 women are burned to death every year over dowry disputes in India. This figure does not count women killed by other means or women who survive the burning or women killed for reasons other than dowry disputes. The clients of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are still pedophiles, and still free, putting innocent children at risk. You're never truly guaranteed that the porn you're watching is free of abuse. There's horror stories from current porn stars about lack of consent for certain acts, surprise anal, shitty contracts, told you're locked in for one scene, but it's 5, and being lied to about your number of partners for a scene. And then there's still sex trafficking and home movies those monsters put out. But after the Amaranth drama, it's more clear you can't be 100% positive that the person you're pleasing yourself to isn't being abused, coerced, forced in some way to perform those acts. Most people have an above-average amount of arms and legs. A horrific percentage of the ships sailing around on our oceans are staffed by people who are either outright slaves, or working in extreme indentured slavery circumstances.